Good morning, everybody. My name is Sergeant Danny DePietro. I'm the Communications Sergeant at the Sheriff's Office. We appreciate you all joining us today for this press conference related to the 1974 double homicide. Initially, you're going to hear from Sheriff Pat Garrett, and after that, you'll hear from Detective Mark Polvoni. He's the lead investigator on this case right now. Afterwards, you'll be able to hear from the family member of Paul Zito in an interview for media who is present on scene. So without waiting any longer, Sheriff Garrett.
Good morning. My name is Pat Garrett, and I'm the Washington County Sheriff. Thank you for joining us today. We are here to announce an arrest in the 1974 murders of Donald Bartron and Peter Zito Jr., two teenagers who were shot and killed in the parking lot of the Oak Hills Recreation Center. I want to recognize one person in particular who is with us today, and that is Peter Zito Jr.'s sister, Barbara. Barbara, thank you very much for being with us. And to Barbara and the entire Bartron and Zito families, I want to acknowledge the loss of your loved ones many years ago and what you've had to endure waiting for today. The Sheriff's Office is committed to investigating every cold case, exhausting all leads, reviewing case details to see if new techniques new technology might provide new solutions. This work is done by detectives from our Violent Crimes Unit as they have time, in addition to carrying an already very busy caseload. While solving homicides that have grown cold over many years is important to our community and our office, as you can imagine, it's incredibly important to the victims' families. Detectives work to provide closure to these cases whenever possible and to hold individuals accountable who are responsible for these horrific crimes, even decades later. I will now be followed by Detective Mark Polvoni, who's the lead investigator, who will detail the steps taken which resulted in the arrest of the person responsible for Don and Peter's deaths. Mark?
Thank you, Sheriff, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Mark Polvoni. I'm a detective here at the Washington County Sheriff's Office. Just before 4 a.m. on October 3rd, 1974, an Oregonian newspaper delivery driver reported seeing a person on the ground next to a car parked at the Oak Hills Recreation Center. The first deputy got there in less than 3 minutes. That deputy was Jim Spinden, who later became the elected sheriff of Washington County. Then Deputy Spinden pulled into the parking lot and saw a 1956 Oldsmobile with the hood and trunk open. When he walked up, he saw 18-year-old Peter Zito Jr. lying on the ground next to the driver's door. 16-year-old Donald Bartron had been working on the engine and was slumped over under the open hood. Both teens had been shot multiple times in the head with a .22 caliber gun. Detectives were called out right away and began their investigation. Multiple neighbors said they heard gunshots around 12:30 in the morning. Detectives initially arrested Joseph Amir Wilson. Much of what followed was reported in the news at the time and in follow-up news stories since. Detectives learned Mr. Wilson had been assaulted by someone at the rec center a few hours before the murders and thought he wanted to get even. Detectives suspected Mr. Wilson wanted to kill the person who beat him up and to also kill that person's brother, but instead killed Don and Pete, or Donnie and Pete as their family called them, in a case of mistaken identity. However, Mr. Wilson denied any involvement and no physical evidence ever connected him to these murders. The district attorney dropped charges against Mr. Wilson a few months later. Even while Mr. Wilson was in custody, at least one detective never believed he was responsible for the murders. Detective Jim Welch found out Donnie worked at the Black Angus restaurant with a person named Steve Chris, who had reason to be upset with Donnie and Pete. Steve was 17 years old at the time. In December of 1974, about 2 months after these murders, Deputy Spinden arrested Steve Chris for theft. During that arrest, Deputy Spindon found an illegally concealed .22 caliber handgun in Steve's car. Detective Welch had the gun taken to the crime lab for testing the same day. A few days later, the crime lab reported that gun was not a match to the murder scene, so the sheriff's office eventually returned that gun to Steve Criss. Steve joined the United States Army and was based at Fort Lewis in Washington. On October 8, 1976, Steve murdered his commanding officer, Sergeant Jacob Kim Brown. Steve damaged Sergeant Brown's car and owed him a few $100s. Instead of paying his debt, he shot Sergeant Brown 5 times in the head. He used the same .22 caliber handgun which had been found in his car in December 1974. Steve pled guilty to that murder and was sentenced to 35 years at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, although he was paroled and released in 1988 after serving just 12 years. While reviewing the case file, we decided to take a second look at the ballistic testing, since it had been done nearly 50 years ago. Detective Shannon Wild is my partner on this case, and she has helped extensively, particularly with the ballistics. She submitted ballistic evidence to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, more commonly known as the ATF. That same day, an ATF supervisor notified Detective Wild there was a presumptive match, showing the gun Steve Criss used to murder Sergeant Brown was in fact the same gun he used to murder Donald Bartron and Pete Zito Jr. The next step was to confirm that presumptive match, which was done at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. Lab technicians also confirmed the gun Steve possessed in December 1974 when he was stopped by Deputy Spindon, and then used in the October 1976 murder, was also used to murder Don and Pete. To date, this is the oldest known match nationwide the ATF has ever confirmed for a prosecutable case. Earlier this week, this case was presented to a grand jury in Washington County. The grand jury indicted 65-year-old Stephen Paul Criss for 2 counts of murder in the second degree. On Wednesday, detectives arrested Mr. Criss and lodged him on those charges. Mr. Criss was living in Aloha and had been working in Hillsboro at the time of his arrest. He was arrested without incident near his home. Mr. Criss was taken into custody using the same pair of handcuffs used when Deputy Spindon arrested him in December 1974. Although there are additional facts which led to Mr. Criss's indictment and arrest, because this remains an ongoing investigation, we will not be able to share all of those at this time. A case like this is only solved through the efforts of many people. Thank you to the Oregon State Police Forensic Lab, the ATF, the Pierce County Sheriff's Department in Washington, and the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. Although Detective Jim Welch passed away more than 10 years ago, I want to acknowledge his work on this case. Detective Welch never believed Joe Wilson was the killer, and he correctly identified Steve Criss as the suspect within weeks of the murders. Detective Welch continued his investigation, even though at the time Joe Wilson had been arrested, indicted, and was in custody. His investigation in 1974 documented and preserved vital evidence, and without his excellent police work, this case would never have been solved. And I've spoken with his family to share our appreciation. Too often our civilian and non-sworn staff also go without the recognition they deserve. I want to personally thank Investigative Support Specialist Julie Thurber. Julie spent many hours helping me organize this case file and the documents collected over 50 years. Without her crucial work, we could never have made sense of what we had and what steps were needed. Similarly, Senior Evidence Officer Kelly Marsden helped me review the evidence and preserve it properly. That allowed us to develop new leads and confirm several others. I also want to recognize Sergeant Jacob Kim Brown's family, as this development is a reminder of their loss. We have made extensive efforts to locate his surviving family members. We have made similar efforts to identify any of Joseph Wilson's family members so we can apologize directly. Although the charges against Mr. Wilson were dropped in January 1975, it is clear he was innocent and should never have been arrested. Mr. Wilson passed away in Portland in 2000. Unfortunately, as both Mr. Wilson and Sergeant Brown have fairly common names, we have so far been unsuccessful in finding their relatives. If anyone is able to connect us with either family, I would ask you to please reach out to me so we can make that connection. Finally, I want to echo Sheriff Garrett's appreciation for the Bartron and Zito families and to Barbara here in person, and acknowledge how difficult it must have been to wait 48 years for this moment. I hope this arrest brings some small measure of comfort and closure for you all. Thank you.
My sincere thanks to Detective Mark Pavoni and the entire Sheriff's Office team and our partners for solving this case. I also want to, on behalf of everyone at the Sheriff's Office, personally apologize to the late Joseph Wilson and his family for Mr. Wilson's wrongful arrest in 1974. I am extremely thankful the charges were dropped before prosecution, but that does not change the fact that he spent several months in jail charged with 2 murders he did not commit. I also want to recognize former Sheriff's Office deputies, investigators, and leaders who worked on this case going all the way back to that early morning call in 1974. As Detective Pavoni mentioned, their work preserved the possibility for justice in this case. And in fact, justice would not have been possible without their work. Finally, it's worth restating our appreciation and to the Zito and the Bartron families for their patience over these many years, and just recognize the loss that they have suffered, and we just hope that this arrest provides them some peace. I will be followed by Sergeant DiPietro. Thank you.
All right, at this time it concludes our press conference, but we will be taking questions. Please understand this is an open investigation. There are going to be some questions that we're not going to be able to answer, so please understand that.
Has there been a confession?
We're not going to be able to talk about any of the specifics of Mr. Chris's interview just because the court case is still pending.
Are you able to say what led to the argument back then at the Black Angus that led to him shooting both of them?
I don't think we can make a specific connection between an argument and the direct result in the shootings happening. We know that there was an argument that happened at the Black Angus involving Donnie and particularly Donnie and Mr. Chris. Beyond that, making a more specific link, we're not able to do right now.
You said he was arrested without incident. Has he been generally cooperative?
I think I'll just leave it at that, there was no other specific incident that resulted in his arrest. That was a cooperative process. There was nothing unique about the arrest itself.
All right. So like I said earlier, for media who are on scene here, we will have Mr. Zito's sister, family member available for interviews, so please just come find me and we can arrange that in another location. If you want a private interview with Detective Pavoni, that's also available as well. So thank you everyone for coming out.